Hey everybody, thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry. I've got some housekeeping to do here in the shop. I'm getting things put away and organized more all the time, but I've gotten to the point where this old table saw needs some attention. A number of people have asked about the mobile base that I made for this. I made it a lot of years ago and obviously didn't do a build video, but I put a top on it. This top is 3/4 inch particle board with laminate Formica on top and the bottom. Got a router table insert in here. And this is a lot better than the original extension table that came with the Unisaw. That initial table was only as long as the fence rail here and only as wide as the table. I made this a little bit oversized for a bigger work surface, and I beefed up the frame underneath. I made a welded steel angle iron frame, screwed this top on there. I've replaced this a couple times. It's done the job, but again, it's getting worn. The screws are working out. It's got a bow to it. The edges are all chewed up from accidental encounters with routers and stuff. So it's time to upgrade this panel. So I want to do a video showing a few things about that upgrade, but then when I have the saw taken apart, you can see how this rolling mobile base is assembled, what I did to put it together. It's pretty specific to this saw. This is a Delta Unisaw, vintage 1982. I was working for a company, took this saw out of its crate when it was brand new and used it in a cabinet shop, building cabinets for convenience stores. I quit the company. Years later, the company folded and they were liquidating equipment, and I was able to get this saw again. And I got it again in probably 1986 or 1987, and I've had it up and running ever since. The table saw is the workhorse of the shop, and it needs to be accurate, precise, versatile, everything else for all the various projects I do on it. It's going to be a rainy weekend. I don't think I'll be able to get out on my mountain bike, so I'm going to tear into this and make some changes. And I hope you find the setup interesting and maybe adaptable to a saw or a piece of equipment you're using to make it more functional, sturdy, and versatile. I don't really know how the video shoot's going to go because of all the varied things I have to do on this, but the main point is to replace this 3/4 inch particle board tabletop with an incredibly heavy and dense piece of phenolic resin board. This is 3/4 inch material. You can tell by my grunting and the sound, it's very heavy, extremely dense and stiff. It's got a nice gray coating on it. And there's a serendipitous backstory to getting this piece of phenolic resin board. It's not necessarily something I would have gone out and bought, but it's ideal for the situation. But a piece like this might be $300 or $400, I'm not sure. But the brother-in-law of a guy I used to work with by the name of Curtis thought I might like to use this stuff, got a hold of me through the Next Level Carpentry channel and offered it. I accepted the offer, and now I get to upgrade to some pretty remarkable stuff on the old table saw. So thanks, Curtis, I appreciate it. So switching out the top is job one for the table saw project. But while I'm at it, there's a few other projects that have to happen. I'm not going to put this router base setup back in here. I'll get a router lift of some sort, but I've got to pick out the brand and model and style, so I'm just going to replace the top for now. Another thing is I've got this shelf here, and in the old shop I stored my scroll saw under there because I didn't have anywhere else to put it, but this is dysfunctional. I put the rip fence in there when I'm not using it, but it falls around and that's annoying, so I'm going to cut that table out of there, and then at some point, probably not in this video, I'll come up with somehow that I can slide that rip fence in here to store it on the table saw. And then I want to incorporate a place to store this Osborne EB3 miter fence and a couple other miter gauges that came with the saw. I want to have them all handy here, and I'm not sure what I'll do with the rest of that space, but I'll put something underneath there. There's a few more things that need to happen here. When I built the mobile base, I centered the wheels underneath this cabinet, kind of under the center of mass of the table. And these two wheels, one in front and one in back, allow the table to roll straight like this. And a single swiveling wheel here allows me to maneuver the table saw And this wheel has a lock on it, so I can lock it in place if I need to. And that's a good design for function, but some of you know in my other shop I didn't have a dust collector. But when I got the G700 dust collector and had to have access to inside the cabinet, the wheel where I originally put it in the middle was in the way, so I had to cut that wheel loose and move it back. But now the wheel on this side of the cabinet, on the other side of the cabinet are offset, and it makes it difficult to swivel the saw around. And one of those wheels just skips across the floor and the other one rolls, so I need to cut this wheel loose and move it so it's directly across the cabinet from the other one. And that's another project that I'm going to do. Not a lot of detail there, but I'll try to shoot a little video of that. And last but not least is addressing the shroud that covers the motor for dust collection. I made a pattern, used my template process for making a pattern, and I made this enclosed case. I used plexiglass for this surface, and that's all works great to enclose the motor, but unfortunately this curve is too flat. So when I tilt the saw to a 45-degree angle, the end of the motor actually pushes through. It pushes through that plexiglass. It split it. So I need to make a new pattern with a different contour, so there's room for the motor to pivot up to 45 degrees and back down. And I realize all the things I'm doing in this video are pretty specific to this saw, but I hope you'll get some ideas on what's possible if you have the ability to cut and weld steel for making custom mobile bases. You'll be able to see the structure of this when I get the top off. I've got to tip the saw up on end. And with a little creative thinking, I would guess that you could adapt this to machines or equipment you have in your shop to make them portable and versatile. Relocating the wheel on the front of the table saw so it matches the wheel on the back is the nastiest item on my list of housekeeping chores, so I'm going to tackle that first to get it out of the way. And while I'm into the cutting and grinding, I'll get rid of this rollout shelf at the same time. An angle grinder and thin cutoff wheels are indispensable for this sort of remodeling work on metal. I've got this Metabo that I've had for a number of years, and it's a 5-inch size because the discs have a greater reach and a little longer life compared to a 4.5-inch tool. This model has a positive spindle lock for changing the blades. That's easily accessible, and the guide or the guard is sturdy and has a positive lock for rotation. I don't have to unscrew anything. I just push a lever and can pivot the guard around where I need it. The cutoff wheels I'll use for this are just 40,000ths of an inch thick and slice like a scalpel through steel and make quick work of remodeling work, working with metal. I'm always amazed to watch cowboys get a horse to lay down or stand up, and standing this table saw on end kind of reminds me of that. And I forgot that I have this special fence attachment for cutting thin laminates stored in the fence guide, so it falls out in the process of standing up the saw. Now I can easily access the wheel for cutting it off and welding it back in its new location. And the mount for these wheels is just a modified piece of angle iron. This is 1/4 inch thick. It was probably 3 by 3 by 1/4 angle. I cut one leg off and then drilled holes so they line up with the casters for rolling the saw. And an additional note about wheels for shop equipment, and all casters are not created equal. The density of the material that makes up the wheels varies, and these wheels have a very high impact density material. It's some sort of plastic, but even with all the weight of the saw and whatever I stack on it, it doesn't create flat spots in the wheels, whereas some of the rubber types will do that after the machine sits in place for a while. Cutting steel and welds is always kind of a nasty, unpleasant job, which is why I've put off relocating this wheel for as long as I have. Plus the fact that I didn't make it easy on myself, because I got a little carried away with the amount of weld I used to attach this angle to the mobile base frame. You can see how this frame is constructed. It's just rectangular tubular steel for the main structure and framework, and I have a couple of pieces of 2 by 2 by 8-inch angle that actually support the table saw in the frame. To support the single wheel at this end of the mobile base, I've got a heavier angle. This is 2 by 2 by 1/4, and then some custom fabricated flat steel pieces to make up this little carrier for the locking swiveling wheel on the end. The upper framework, this set of legs, is just screwed to the bottom of the tabletop, and it's just bolted to the bottom frame rather than welding all this together to make a bigger, more awkward assembly. And you can see on the underside of the top, I replaced the top in March of 2006 and again in November of 2014. So it's been 5 years since its last upgrade, so it's more than due for a replacement. I do not profess to be a professional welder, and I like the statement that says, good welders weld, bad welders grind. Well, I'm more of a grinder than a welder, but nothing I've ever made has fallen apart in use for lack of weld quality. After starting to cut off the angle iron piece that holds the wheel in place, I decided it was a little too awkward and borderline dangerous, and chose to reposition the saw and remove the base so I could work on it better. Plus, I'll be able to paint it before I put it all back together. And this goes back to what I said a minute ago about bolting the base to the uprights rather than welding them, because 2 bolts and I've easily removed this frame for cutting, grinding, welding, and painting. That's the fun thing about welding. A little bit holds a lot until it doesn't. And I'll slice off the welds that hold these uprights for that shell, as long as I've got that laser cutting wheel on the grinder. These 40 thousandths thick discs wear down faster than thicker ones, like this one must be 1/8 of an inch, but they cut so much faster, it's worth it to me. In a situation like this, cutting this weld is where I like the 5-inch size grinder instead of a 4.5, because it's got a little more reach to get into tight places like this inside corner. And after a few quick cuts on strategic welds, that frame is a thing of the past too. And now I switch from that 40 thousandths laser cutting disc to a regular steel grinding disc to clean up the excess weld and this little bracket before I weld it back in place. And there's where that easily accessible positive arbor lock comes into play. And finally, a quick pass with a 60 grit flap disc, and this frame will be ready for a coat of paint. I've got all the parts and surfaces all ground flat and clean, ready to put back together, so I can clamp this bracket in place straight across from the other wheel and weld it. My weapon of choice is this Lincoln Power MIG 180C. It's a great welder, and I'm running the shielding gas rather than a flux core wire. And this machine has plenty of heat and power for this sort of weld, with the main limitation being the weldee, not the welder. And make no mistake, this video is not a welding lesson. It's a video showing me welding stuff together for use in the shop. Everything I'm doing works great, works fine, but I've never taken one single welding lesson in my life. Everything I know is just from experience welding stuff for 30 years plus. So take it for what it's worth. I use this auto darkening welding helmet, which is a pretty sweet deal. It's a Jackson helmet. I've had it for a number of years, and it really helps the process along with the other tools and stuff I use here, but I'm not the authority on this. I'm merely a participant. Like I said, I'm probably a better grinder than a welder, but I get by. And after a little grinding touch-up, I'm satisfied with the results I got relocating this wheel. The best way to clean up iron like this before painting is by sandblasting. But the second best thing is just to go over it with a flap disc to clean up and smooth up the surface, remove rust, etc. So that's what I'm going to do today. After spending a good half an hour cleaning up all these parts with a 60 grit flap disc on the grinder, they're all cleaned up, deburred, derusted, and ready for paint. I coat the bare metal with this Ace Premium Gray Primer. The thing I like best about this Ace paint is the nice fan spray tip. Instead of spraying a dot, it sprays a fan that allows me to get even coverage quicker. As with all rattle can paint, it's the best practice to start with a misting coat or a tack coat to begin with, let that set up, and then follow with a full wet coat. And by doing a rattle can finish in 2 coats like this, it's a lot easier to get a nice glossy finish without unsightly drips and runs. And note that you can still see bare metal through this initial tack coat, and that's a sign that you're getting the right amount. If you can't tell there's paint, you don't have enough. If you can't see the metal, you got too much. When I'm feeling responsible, I wear this dual cartridge respirator by Honeywell. The large cartridges make it easy to breathe, and the charcoal filters mean that I can be in a room full of stinky paint and not even smell it. It hardly takes any time at all for that initial tack coat to dry and set up. I use a Scotch-Brite pad. If any imperfections show up, I just dust them off because that paint dries so fast. And it's not exceptionally warm in the shop, so this process goes pretty quick and yields great results. As soon as that tack coat's dry, I can just flip the pieces over and give them that full wet coat, which will take longer to dry, but I'm not worried about runs. I use these pointed sticks to hold the work up so the paint doesn't stick to the table. They just have a very fine edge, so I can flip the piece over and barely makes a fingernail mark in the primer, so I don't worry about it. I can just go right over that with a finished coat. What I'm striving for in this coat of primer is a nice smooth finish that's well adhered to the metal. Primer is designed to stick to metal, and paint is designed to stick to primer. And with a smooth primer coat, you can be assured of a nice smooth finish coat for professional results. It took exactly 1 full spray can to coat these parts with primer. And I'll give 5 stars to anyone that can tell me what the official name is for the ball in the bottom of a spray can. It has a name, and if you know what it is, put it in the comments. Once the primer's had an hour to dry, I scuff it with a purple Scotch-Brite pad to remove any little imperfections and rough spots. Another benefit of the process of scuffing this with a Scotch-Brite pad, if there's any adhesion problems with the primer, they'll show up now so they can be repaired before the finished coat is sprayed on. And then apply the hammered finish in the same manner as the primer with a thin tack coat and then a full wet coat. There's one difference with the hammered finish. I found that I get more hammer effect if, while the second wet coat is still wet, I just hold the can back about 20 inches and just mist the spray on there, and that seems to put more of the fisheye effect and make it look more hammered. Well, I lucked out and was able to get a nice full double coat on all these parts with one rattle can of that hammerite, or hammer tone. I used to call it hammerite. And that's what it looks like. I aired the shop out. And you can kind of see what this looks like. I've got to turn the furnace on for a while and get this dry before I can put it back together. But I hope that shows how the tack coat and the full coat process gets a nice glossy finish, even everywhere. There's no rough spots. And then by holding this can back and just misting on, I tried to catch that in the video. And I think you can see here in this wheel bracket, the one that got relocated, how it has that hammered finish with all those little fish eyes in there, and that's a whole lot better when you can mist on a light coat over a wet coat. Other areas like in here where the table saw sits and they don't get seen, I didn't do so much of that hammered effect because it's not that important down in there, and I didn't have a bunch of extra paint. I made extra effort here on the top of this pivot wheel flange because this area shows when the saw is all put back together and the wheel's mounted underneath here. So maybe I owe you an apology. I kind of went way off into the weeds on this welding and finishing process, but I kind of thought that that might be meaningful for anybody that's making custom metal stuff and get into the finishing process, because this gives you a nicer end result. So I'm going to just fast forward through putting all this back together, putting it back on the saw, and then tipping the saw back down before I go into the next part and talk about switching out the panel itself. I guess I'll give you a close-up of the underside of this table saw top structure while that paint's drying with a handheld shot so that you can see how angle iron and rectangular tube were used to create this structure for supporting the top. This metal is all commonly available, and with a little creative cutting and fabrication can be assembled to make a very, very rigid support structure for the table saw top. And this shot shows a steel strap that's used kind of as an interface between the cast iron table saw top and this welded steel framework. And shooting from this angle, you get a real good idea of how the dust enclosure shroud encloses the motor for dust collection. I let this hammer tone paint dry during supper, so now it's nice and dry. It's not fingerprinting, so I can put the wheels back on and then put the frame back underneath the table saw. And I'm really glad to finally have a respectable finish on this base, because it's just been a grinder marks and rust for 30 years. Wow. Just like that. Well, with that change complete, the saw is more agile than ever. It's really easy to move, which will be nice for positioning it in the shop for different work operations. There's a little bit of an issue here because the wheels are past the center of mass. If I push down on this, the table saw actually tilts. I don't think I wish I put these wheels on the other side because it would make this harder to spin around, but I might have to put a wheelie bar on here for when I'm working. We'll see how that goes, but once I add this phenolic top to here, that's going to add probably 100 pounds of weight on this side, and it'll make it more stable. Plus, it'll maintain maneuverability. So I'm excited about that, and it's time to take off this old top and attach the new one. This new top is 2 inches longer and 1.5 inches wider than the existing top, which is in turn bigger than the original top. So that extra work surface is going to be nice. Man, that's heavy. The new phenolic top has a beveled edge on it, but I want a nice tight fit like this Formica top to that cast iron. So I'm going to have to true this edge up to make it flush so it fits tight together. And I'll do that first. I need to pull the protective film off the phenolic sheet and inspect both faces to see if there's a top and a bottom. All in all, it's in pretty good shape for the shape it's in. Close inspection shows me that both faces of this phenolic sheet are flawless, but this one is slightly more flawless than the other one. So this becomes the top, and I'm going to square up this end to fit next to the cast iron. I'll do that by making a perfectly square line on the end with this framing square, and then following that line with a flush trim router bit and a straight edge. And I'm about to find out just how tough this phenolic board is to machine with this router bit. I've never machined a panel of this size or this thickness of this stuff before, so let's see what we got. And you don't have to be a clairvoyant to predict that. The camera battery died just as I was finishing up. Go figure. Well, that might be the last thing I flush trim with that old bit, but I got a nice clean edge on here because this is some really tough stuff, but I like what I got, and this machined edge will fit nicely up against the cast iron. That is a nice clean crisp edge, and I think that's sharp enough to cut my finger if I wasn't careful. And I've got one of my best blocks for demanding sanding. This is 150 grit with that purple 3M belt on there, and I'll use it to knock that razor sharp corner off there so I don't cut myself if I get careless. And that, my friends, is perfect. And 3 corners of this new top will be exposed, so I want to round them off like these so that I don't impale my hip bone on those sharp corners when I'm working. A 3/4 inch radius is just about right for these, and I've got this old socket that's about 1.5 inches in diameter. So I'll use that to make a radius template out of this Russian birch plywood by just drawing a circle on here to show what that radius needs to look like. And then I cut close to that scribed line with the miter box. first with a cut at 45 and following it up with 2 cuts at 22.5. Then I clamp the plywood in a vise, use an 80 grit best block for demanding sanding to smooth the facets off this corner. And with those simple steps, I can now replicate the exact same radius on all 3 exposed corners by first tracing the radius from the template and then cutting that corner off with a skill saw. And following it up with that same flush trim router bit. And you gotta love it when something so simple works so well. Well, I got all 3 corners rounded to perfection. So now, at long last, I'm ready to remove the old top, fit and install the new one. Woohoo! And that handful of number 14 by 3/4 inch and 1 inch screws held that top on there nicely for a good 5 years. And with the top off there, you can get a pretty good idea what this framework looks like. It consists of a framework made of 2x2 angle and 1x2 rectangular tubing, just welded in place. The whole top is nice and flat. Looks like I added a cross brace in here in 2014 because the table was sagging. And the face of this angle iron is exactly 3/4 of an inch below the cast iron top. The screw holes are just drilled through that angle iron. And I've got to notch out for this lip on the edge of the table saw and these bolt heads that hold this piece of flat steel on here. That way I'll get a flush fit of everything when it's done. Eyeballing down here, you can see that that angle iron is dead flat. The whole surface is flat. The trouble I was having with the particle board was that the screws on the end came loose and the end of the particle board was starting to curl up from extreme use and borderline abuse. 3/4 inch melamine faced particle board is identical thickness as this phenolic board, so I tested my rabbet setup with the router on this particle board to make sure I like how it fits before committing to routing that same rabbet in the underside of the phenolic sheet. I'm using an old rabbeting bit set for an 1/8 inch wide rabbet, about 1/4 inch deep. And I don't know if I'm ruining this rabbet bit in the process or if it lives to rabbet another day. And that's pretty impressive machining, but my word, this stuff is hard and dense. I did the same thing with the 3 mortises for the bolt heads. I tested them on my pattern, tested the fit, and transferred the marks to the phenolic resin before milling them out with a router. I'm just using a 1/4 inch straight bit in this Bosch Colt router, and it gets the job done, but not without a little bit of whining. And I really like how clean that mills out. I'll add a word of caution here. When there's that much chatter and vibration, make sure you double check your router bit to an original depth of cut, because that vibration can easily wiggle the bit loose and make your cut wander deeper than you intended. And that little bit of detail routing work completes the milling for fitting this new top to the table saw. Because the old 3/4 inch particle board top with a layer of Formica on it is a little bit thicker, almost 13/16, and this phenolic sheet is exactly 3/4. I've got to do a little adjusting of the steel in relation to the cast iron top to make sure everything comes out flush. I'll add a word of caution when working with material that's this heavy, this dense, and has such sharp edges and corners. I'm always very, very careful in handling it because a slip and a fall would mean a broken bone for sure and an amputation possibly. So that's good to keep in mind when handling this stuff. And once I make that minor height adjustment, this is going to be marvelous. To secure the phenolic sheet to the frame on the table saw, I just used a Sharpie marker to mark the bolt holes on the underside of the sheet. Since phenolic sheet is so incredibly hard and dense, I'll drill and tap it like it was steel. I want to use 1/4-20 bolts for securing the phenolic to the frame. So I take the number 7 drill bit size for tapping a 1/4-20 hole, and I've drilled a hole into a block of wood on the drill press. Then I mark out the length of the drill bit and subtract 11/16 of an inch and I'll cut at this line on the miter box. And that gives me a custom gauge block for drilling holes 11/16 of an inch deep in all the screw locations. To finish up, I put a piece of guide tape on a 1/4 tap at 5/8 of an inch and ran the threads in those holes. So that I can use stubby 1/4 inch bolts to hold the top to the framework, no problem. To account for the 1/16 inch difference in thickness between the top that was on here and the new 3/4 inch top, I need to shim up these rails. And what I decided to do is a bit unconventional. I'm using this temporary surface protection. It's a very high density cardboard product, and it's just a touch over 1/16 of an inch thick. I'll cut strips, put them on the rails, drill the holes, and when I bolt the top down, it'll compress to be a perfectly flush fit between the cast iron top and the new phenolic top. It was super easy to cut 2-inch strips of the floor protector using a utility knife and a standard sheetrock square. And I had 3 perfect strips in no time. It was easy to cut the strips to length, stick them down with some double stick tape, and drill them for bolt clearance through the holes. If I did my homework right, it should just be a matter of sliding the top into place and running the bolts in. That is a thing of beauty. And now securing the top to the frame is as easy as running the bolts in to those tapped and drilled holes. Well, with the last of those bolts put in place and adjustments for fine-tuning the 2 top surfaces here, the upgrade to this phenolic resin board top from the old particle board and Formica one is complete. The final step I'll do for this is give it a wipe with lacquer thinner and a coat of paste wax, and it'll be simply marvelous to work on. I'm super stoked to have that project completed. The saw is very mobile with the wheels in the proper place, and the fact that I finally got a hammer tone finish on it is making me happy. As you can tell by the lack of light coming through the windows, I've been at this project all day. I got way more involved in showing how to weld and finish that base and all the other details about installing this top. So I'm just going to hold off on the enclosure for the dust collector underneath. I'll have to do that in a separate video. This one's kind of going to run long enough as it is, but thanks for sticking around and watching the process. I hope there's things you can use here from the metalwork, from the design of the stand, and maybe working with phenolic resin materials. I'm hoping you can use those in projects that you're working on, or at least find it interesting. So I'm going to wrap up this video and call it a night, and ask you that if you like what you saw here, appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing if you haven't already. Hit the thumbs up button, and that registers a little bell over there at YouTube somewhere, and they know things are happening at Next Level Carpentry. I want to thank the growing list of patrons on Patreon. I'll stick them in the video here somewhere, and as they scroll by, I want to let each one of you guys know how much I appreciate what you're doing, going above and beyond to support Next Level Carpentry. It makes this whole thing work out. For everybody else, things like the t-shirt and this goofy poster up here, those are available on Teespring, where sales help support the channel with a little bit of shared revenue with Teespring. And last but not least, there's a link in the video description below that shows tools and materials and supplies that you saw used in this video. If you're lacking any of those things and can't find them locally, purchase them through one of those links. It's the same low online price to you, but Amazon pays a small ad fee that helps keep the lights on here at Next Level Carpentry. And I guess I can wrap up with that and tell you, as always, thanks for watching. Nice to meet you, new top. I guess I've served my purpose here. I'm going to be on my way. Off to the home where all good table saw tops end up after they've served their purpose here on Earth. Goodbye.